Okay. Okay, good morning, everybody. What I'll do is I'll just go through my presentation and then you can ask questions. So what we will look at is how to do a proper statistical analysis. So the first thing we're looking at is data phishing or p-hacking that is wrong. So what is totally wrong is to take, say for example, you have a questionnaire and you take one of the biographical variables and you just compare it to all the questions in the questionnaire, and then you fish for significance. So you look at, say there's 50 tests, and then you just present your significant results. So that is wrong. That's not the way to go about. But however, you need to see the bigger picture from your data set. So what you'll do is you will do some analysis to get to know your data, because your data will tell you a story. So that's the opposite of this p-hacking or data phishing. Now, what you need to do is you need to answer your research questions or test hypothesis. And that must be your focus. Then also, if there's any rules of thumb, because there's usually a lot of rules of thumb in statistical analysis, you must always remember you must do it in the context of your own study. So it's not fixed in stone. It's just rules of thumb. Okay, this is just some general comments. Then what we will look at next is the criteria for doing a proper statistical analysis. So there's different things we're looking at. So what we look at first is the assumptions of the technique. There's no order in this. I'll just look at all the criteria that must be in place. So when you do a proper statistical analysis, you need to adhere to the assumptions of the statistical technique. If the assumptions is violated, you need to do something about it. Maybe use another test, maybe do some transformation. Otherwise, your analysis could be wrong. Your p-value could be incorrectly calculated. Then you'll have descriptive statistics. This would be to describe your analysis. What we'll do is we will look at the example. Then you also have a corresponding graph. This is to graphically show or present your analysis. Then you have statistical significance, and this is with your p-value from your statistical test. Now, and then the fifth thing would be practical significance or effect size. Now, effect size or practical significance is not influenced by sample size. So say, for example, you do a statistical test, you have a huge data set, and now you get significance, but the effect, say it's a difference between two averages, is very small. Then you can report and say, but the effect size is small. So practically, it's a small effect, however, it was statistically significant. Or what can also happen is you don't have enough data, so the power of your statistical test is not strong enough to detect significance. Say, for example, you only have 10 people, then it's not statistically significant, but say it's a very large effect, then you can report and say, but it's not statistically significant, but there was a large effect. So further research must be done into this and get more data to do the analysis. Okay, so that's the different criteria that must be in place to do a proper statistical analysis. You will not always report on all of this. Say, for example, there's a lot of statistical analysis that you do. Maybe you won't put in all the graphs, or when you report it, you'll have a table, but you must say something about it. You must always say something about all of these criteria. If you tested the assumptions, for example, you just note that you tested the assumptions and it was satisfied. But all of this must be taken into account to do a proper analysis. Okay, let us just look at the simple hypothesis here. We have the research hypothesis, which is the alternative hypothesis. So in this case, this is at the company. They did a communication audit. A questionnaire was used. It was construct scores coming from validated and reliable constructs. So communication was tested with a few Likert scale statements that was reliable and valid. And then a composite score was calculated to get a score for communication. So communication in this case would then be a continuous variable because it's a composite construct score, and the same with timeliness. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to see, is there a relationship between communication and the timeliness of the information? So say the timeliness is more frequent, then the communication improves. Now that's the research hypothesis. Then the opposite of this would be the null hypothesis. So we say there is no statistically significant relationship between the two variables. We can also indicate it by, say, the correlation coefficient. So if the correlation coefficient differs significantly from 0, we could say there is a relationship. If it's not differing significantly from 0, there's no significant relationship. And then what we'll do is we will reject the null hypothesis if the calculated p-value from the data is smaller than 0.05, which is the level of significance. But we'll get to this. Okay, so to do this or test this hypothesis, we'll do a Pearson correlation analysis. So with a Pearson correlation analysis, we test the strength and the direction of a relationship between two variables. Let me just put on my pen. So the strength and the direction. The strength is how strong is this relationship. So this would be effect size. And what's the direction? Is it positive or is it negative? If it's positive, it would mean if you have higher levels of communication or the higher levels of timeliness, you get it more in time, then you get higher levels of communication. If it's negative, it would be the opposite. So in this case, we'll do a Pearson correlation analysis to test the assumption, the relationship between communication and timeliness of information. Now, let us look at the different criteria. So for the first criteria, looking at the descriptive statistics, we can calculate averages and standard deviations. It's composite construct scores. It's a continuous variable. That's why we can calculate the mean and the standard deviation. And that will just tell us what is the levels of communication and the levels of timeliness in the organization. Then in this case, the appropriate graph would be a scatter plot to show the relationship between level timeliness and communication, scatter plot. We will look at all of this just now. Then to test significance, statistical significance, we'll get a p-value from the statistical test. Now, when you do a Pearson correlation analysis, then you actually do a one sample t-test against 0. So what you'll do is you'll test the correlation coefficient against the constant, which is 0, to see if it differs significantly from 0. If it differs significantly from 0, we could say there is a significant relationship. So say, for example, your correlation coefficient is 0.3, and if this is the p-value is significant, then this differs significantly from 0. So there's a significant relationship. Then practical significance would be assessed by the correlation coefficient itself. It will tell us if it's positive or negative, and then how strong is this relationship. Then the assumptions we need to look at is normality. There must be a linear relationship, and there must be homoscedasticity. So normality would mean that both the variables must be normally distributed. So communication relationships, the distribution must be normal, and communication and timeliness. And then there must be a linear relationship between the two variables. If it's non-linear, we can't do a Pearson correlation. And then homoscedasticity, that would make more sense on the graph. That would mean over the level of the x-axis, that would be, in this case, timeliness, the variance will not change. But we will look at this when we do the graph. Then it will make more sense to you. but that's the assumptions that must be in place. If this assumptions is violated, we can't do a Pearson correlation. So say, for example, if normality is violated, then we'll do something like a Spearman correlation. Now let us look at the graph. There's a scatter plot. So there's the x-axis, the independent variable, the y-axis, the dependent. But in this case, we don't care. We just look at the relationship between the two variables. And then there's timeliness and communication. Now, in this case, we can clearly see there's a linear relationship between the two. When we look at it, if it was non-linear, it would be something like this, non-linear. And then there would be a lot of points here. And then we would not be able to do a Pearson correlation analysis. Then also, when we look at it, let me just take this out. This would be positive, but this would be negative. Negative would mean higher levels of timeliness will be lower levels of communication, and the other way around. Okay. From your research, you'll know if it's a negative or a positive relationship. In this case, it would make sense to be positive because if you get information more timely, communication in the organization will improve. Okay, then let us look at the assumptions. Normality, I mentioned this already. How will we test normality? We will look at the skewness, and we can also look at kurtosis. I will just look at skewness. And then we also look at a histogram that shows the distribution. We will not do a statistical test like something like a Shapiro-Wilk test, because if you do the test, you have a lot of respondents. You will get deviations from normality that's shown in the test. The test will be statistically significant, but then the deviation from normality will not be extreme. Now, the statistical test is usually robust against deviations from the assumptions like normality. So that's why you look for extreme skewness. That's why we will not use the test. We look at the histogram and we look at skewness. Then we look for the linear relationship. We will look at the scatter plot. We already saw in the scatter plot, there seems to be a linear relationship, not nonlinear. And then we will look at homoscedasticity. It will make more sense when I show it to you in the graph. Now let us look at the histograms of the two, or the distributions of the two variables. So there's communication and there's timeliness. So you can see that communication is normally distributed. Timeliness is also normally distributed. Normally distributed would mean a symmetrical distribution. Both sides is the same. Now, when we look for skewness, we look for the extreme tail, so a long tail, so something like this, that would be considered a problem. In this case, there's no problem at all. Something like income, for example, will give you skewness. Okay, then let us look at the skewness. The skewness and the kurtosis, I will just talk about the skewness. Now, there's different schools of thought. Now, if the skewness is inside the range of -1 to +1, it's deemed acceptable. This is a more strict view. A more lenient view would be -2 to +2 inside this range. Because the statistical techniques is robust, this range is actually used more. But it depends on how strict you are. Now, if you look at the skewness figure here, this skewness is inside the range of -1 to +1. It's 0.11. So this is fine for timeliness. And then from communication relationships, it's also inside the range of -1 to +1. So it's acceptable skewness. So we could conclude that normality is in place. Both variables are normally distributed. This is just output from R, the statistical language R. Okay, then looking at the scatter plot, we already looked at the scatter plot. So I just draw a line here to show the linearity. It's linear, not non-linear. So there's a linear relationship and it's positive. It goes in this direction. Negative would be this direction. So linearity is in place. Then we're looking at homoscedasticity. So homoscedasticity would mean over the level of the x-axis, over this axis, we don't want to have a change in the variance. So if you look at this arrows here, you can see the variance is more or less between these two bands. So the variance is staying in the same range. Now say for example, the arrows would be different, or the points. Let me just show you here. Say the points, there was a lot of points here, there was a lot of points here, and it would do something like this. Then the variance is getting larger, it's getting bigger. So the variance is changing over time. So then there's a problem over this axis, not over time, over this axis. Now, then it's not homoscedastic, it's heteroscedastic. In this case, it's not a problem. You can also do a test for this in economic sciences. They use the Breuer-Pagan test, but you can just use a scatter plot. In this case, we can clearly see there's no change in the variance, or it's homogeneous enough, so that's fine. Then we do the statistical test. We test if the correlation coefficient differs significantly from 0. And if that's the case, then it is statistically significant. We choose a level of significance. Usually it's 0.05. That relates to the 95% level of confidence. So we calculate a p-value. If it's smaller than 0.05, we could conclude that there is a significant relationship between the two variables. Okay, then if we do the calculation, this was done in R. Correlation is the function, and there's the p-value calculated from the data. In this case, it's a very small p-value. You can see it's 1.114. The E, scientific notation, the E, so there's 14 zeros in front. So it's 0, and there's a lot of zeros. So this is obviously smaller than 0.05. So we could conclude that there's a significant relationship between communication and timeliness. And then the last thing we're looking at is the strength and the direction of the relationship. We talked about this already. So if it's positive or it could be negative, and if it's near 0, there's no relationship. Because this is perceptions from a questionnaire, we can use Cohen's interpretation. So Cohen's interpretation, 0.1 is weak, medium, or strong. According to your research, your research field, say it's in biological sciences, the correlations would be much higher. Now, in this case, when we calculate the correlation, we get to 0.73. So that's a positive relationship. And it's strong because it's higher than 0.5. So we could conclude that there's a strong and positive relationship between communication and timeliness in the organization. And we know that the assumptions is fine and everything is in place. And it's also a significant relationship. So if you take all of these criteria into account, then you do a proper statistical analysis. Okay, that's my story. If there's questions, you can ask me a question. Monique will start at say 9:30. This was quite a lot to take into 25 minutes, but we will give you the slides to work with if you need the slides. Is there any questions? Thank you, Monique. Thank you, Yuri. So the main point here is just to note that you need to take all of this into account. So when you publish, for example, if you don't look at assumptions, you can make a wrong conclusion. Yes, Janine?
Hi. Okay. So, okay, thank you very much for this. It clears up a lot for me. I don't
Yeah.
work in stats at all.
Oh,
So,
okay.
but I have had to do some tests.
Yes.
So, okay, I'm a little confused sometimes by the sample size. So I get that you want a
Yes.
large enough sample size.
Yeah.
But I've run into a situation where I have too much data.
Yes.
Where I get this test telling me that there is a significant difference.
Yes.
When I know it's not, just by looking
Yeah.
at the data, I know it's not significant, but it's giving me a significance.
Yes.
What is the right? Is there a different test that I need to do, or what do I do to show the non-significance in terms of a statistical value that someone will understand?
Yes. Okay. Can I answer that?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. So what you first want to do is make sure your assumptions here adhere to the assumptions of the statistical test, that it didn't make some error there. So make sure all of that is in place. If everything is in place, it's the correct test, but you have a large data set, then it just means it is statistically significant. So there is an effect. But then you go to the effect size, the practical significance, and say, but this effect is very small. Like in this case, the correlation could be something like 0.05. So it's a very, very weak relationship. And you'll get effect sizes for everything. If it's a t-test, you can look at the Cohen's d, for example. So that's why the effect size is so important.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, that actually emphasizes the whole thing, what I was talking about, this whole issue of sample size. So if you do the analysis like this, then everything would be fine. Because the opposite can also happen. You don't have enough data. You can report there's a very strong relationship, but you didn't have enough data. The power of the statistical test, you can do that calculation is maybe weak, and then you can say for future research you need to gather more data. Any other question?
Hello?
Yes, you can talk.
Okay. Please, though I joined late, so I don't know the minimum sample size for conducting a Pearson correlation. That's one. And the nature of the data, that is the DV and the IV. So what nature of
Yes.
this thing should there be, please? So I don't know, though I came late, perhaps you would have said that before I
Yeah.
joined.
Yeah, because I talked about assumptions. So the variables must be normally distributed. It's two continuous variables. And we don't have a dependent and independent in this case because it's just a correlation. So not one influencing another one. So we're just looking at that relationship. And
Okay.
then the sample size itself, for a correlation, you can get low sample sizes, even something like 20, because you have two variables, you have two measurements to work with. But it totally depends on your data itself.
Okay,
Because if
so
there's a lot of variation, you need a larger sample size.
okay. So with the 20 sample size and you check the all other assumptions and everything is okay, you can go ahead with the basic correlation analysis.
Yes. I would say 30 is actually better, 30, but it depends on the data. But with 30, because that also is with the center limit theorem, 30 So that would give you enough data to work with. But like I said, it depends on the data. You can even get a correlation of 20 or even 10 sometimes. But the moment it goes too low, then you have a problem. You can
Okay, so
also, yeah, yes.
that's what I'm saying, that with 20 sample size and
Yeah,
every other follow suit, like if the thing is normally distributed, the
yes.
look everything, so one can go out with the person correlation analysis. If all
Yeah,
other assumptions are okay.
yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, then it's fine. If it's 20 and everything is in place, then it's fine. All the assumptions is tested, then it's okay. Yeah. Okay, see, it's 9:50 now, Monique. Is it okay? Is everybody fine? Can Monique go on with the qualitative?
Slowly start. Kindly note that I will open some time at the end for questions. So even if you still have questions that you didn't thought of for Hennie at this moment, you can still write them down, and maybe then when I give the space, you can. Like we've mentioned, I am sharing the slides with this presentation recording to those who have attended. So you are able to come back to this information. And then, yeah, let me start by sharing my slides, and then we can start with the qualitative components. All right. So to align the qualitative with the assumption testing of quantitative, we are focusing today on ensuring that when you code your qualitative data, that these insights are of trustworthiness and that you can follow this credible road of ensuring that how you code, that you have not just coded, but coded well. So let's start with this presentation. I'm going to take you through some qualitative coding perspectives. We're going to go into the measures of how to ensure trust. We're going to look at how to code well as what potentially could be a barrier to coding well. And so let's start with the qualitative coding definition. So qualitative research is there to explore the meaning and experiences and perspectives of how people make sense of their world. So it focuses on understanding why participants give certain reasons. However,
sorry, Monique, I can't see the slide.
Oh my gosh, let me see. Thanks, Hennie. I'm going to stop sharing again. And let's just reshare my screen. Just to confirm, you can see the slides now?
Yes, I can see. I can see. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sorry for that. Right. So just to quickly give you an overview again. So qualitative research is there to explore the meaning and experiences and perspectives that people engage with in order to make sense of their world. So the qualitative coding focuses on questions such as how and why, rather than focusing on what or how much. So the typical data here focuses on interviews, focus groups, written reflections, diaries. The main aim here is to see that qualitative data, although we do engage with interviews or so, this information is transcribed to textual information. So these data focuses on the understanding and the experiences and the beliefs and the meaning that these individuals make to it. Therefore, we have no numbers within our data. When we focus on qualitative coding typically looks at the process whereby we break down the analysis into smaller data, what is known as these meaningful units. So it's the process to organize and to see how we can extract certain patterns in order to eventually answer our research question. So quantitative analysis, especially in the assumption testing, is quite structured. However, qualitative is more of an iterative process where you need to critically reflect about how you are identifying this information, how you are going to categorize these segments of perceptions from the participants, and basically how you are going to get towards these meaningful insights. So therefore, we need to consider that when we engage with coding, when we break these segments up into more manageable units by identifying the patterns, by looking at what are the main concepts, and then thinking about, as we go through this process, how we can categorize it, we also need to consider that of two approaches of the reasoning that we employ. So these two approaches are known as inductive and deductive. So inductive is basically where the codes emerge from the voices of the participants. And deductive relates more to if we already have identified a theory or maybe a certain framework, and therefore would like to see how these things apply. So just to give you an example, if we had to start with an inductive process, let's say, for example, this is the interview and these were the transcripted information. If we are following an inductive interview, or inductive reasoning process, we would ensure that when a participant talks about a certain thing, let's say, for example, my participants are talking about managing their workload and how it is quite difficult, we would then inductively highlight that section. And let me just use another color. So we will inductively highlight that section and provide an open code, which basically means it would be created from the voices of the participants. And therefore, if this was a barrier relating to their workload, we could have mentioned difficulties managing the workload. Sorry, I didn't write that out, but that is basically difficulty managing the workload. That is of an inductive nature. Now, if we had to follow the deductive nature, Now, if we had to follow the deductive approach, it would have meant, and let's say, for example, I was focusing on psychological well-being. Deduction means that I already have an outline or a theory or potential codes and themes, and I'm now going to find where this is mentioned. So let's say, for example, I'm focusing on psychological well-being, and therefore I use the PERMA model, which is looking at positiveness, looking at how people engage, how people form relationships, how they are motivated, and how they perceive their accomplishments. For them to be psychologically well, these 5 elements needs to be evident. So therefore, if we're following a deductive approach, we would then, in this interview, focus on, let's say I want to focus on how these individuals build relationships. So therefore, I'm taking the construct, the element of relationships within psychological well-being, and therefore find where participants have mentioned it, and therefore would highlight it. So see the qualitative process of inductive versus deductive, whereby inductive, we induce codes. We don't have any labels in mind. We create the labels from what participants have said. And deductive is either from literature or theory. We've created a framework, a code book of labels, and therefore will only focus on where participants mentioned these things, meaning that I'm not going to find anything other than focusing on, for example, the PERMA framework. So that is the deductive nature. Most qualitative designs follows the inductive form, meaning that we would like to emerge from the data of what participants have mentioned, but especially considering grounded theory and so forth, you can have a combination of inducing and deducing, meaning you have a framework that you are focusing on, and you're only going to deduct this framework. But if participants mention anything outside of this framework, you will still induce these labels as codes. So these approaches can be combined, however, to ensure that we are sticking to the trustworthiness of the study, to ensure that we are following the participants' voices, we like to more overly engage in the inductive process. So we can see that codes reflects the researcher's lens, which basically means that it is a bridge between data collection and your thematic analysis, whereby we would guide how we generate these codes. So if we follow the deductive approach, the guidance is from a framework. And if we follow an inductive approach, the guidance is from the voices of the participants, meaning I label from what they have mentioned. So therefore, this guideline helps us to interpret and see what are the main insights that we can combine from these participants' voices. Let me just remove my ink. My apologies. Now my Zoom is gone. So let me just quickly stop sharing and reshare. Sorry about this. There we go. I can clear everything. So as we move into why coding matters, we can see that this is quite important. Qualitative data, any qualitative approach to analysis, you need to code. This is the basis. Thematic analysis is the basis of all qualitative analysis. So this coding helps us structure based on rich data that could be messy, that we can identify how our key interpretations noted. Coding allows us to carve a structure out based on how it supports systematic thinking, how we identify repeatable insights, as well as to ensure that when we reach our finalized themes, that they aren't just based about your gut feeling, but they are done well. It improves both clarity and ensures credibility of your research. So therefore, you need to consider by going through this iterative process where you refine, identify, refine again, and see, are you on the approach of reaching your research questions or answering your research question? So we need to be transparent within this whole process, meaning that we need to outline how we have created codes. We need to explain this with thick descriptions. Good coding practices builds a strong foundation from what you have identified from the voices of participants. So going through this process means that you're not getting lost in the richness of data and the volume of qualitative information, but that you are focused on what you have done, what you are thinking when you have done this, why this is important, and how it applies to that specific context that you've identified. So we follow the basic step-by-step process of qualitative analysis. So currently on the screen, this is a basic outline, but do note that when you engage with your own thematic analysis, let's say you've not mentioned thematic analysis, but you've mentioned other things such as interpretive phenomenological analysis also, that you need to ensure that you follow the steps and what is mentioned within those analytical processes. Now, looking at the current screen, we can see that this is a basic way of approaching any thematic analysis. And like I've mentioned, you just need to double check if there's an additional step also. But basically, we start with immersing yourself with your context. When you transcribe, I want you to not just transcribe, but listen to the voice inside of your head. Because when we transcribe, our mind is naturally programmed to identify or bring similar things together. So while you are transcribing, make a note, immerse yourself with this information by ensuring that you listen to maybe the preconceived ideas that might become applicable. So we're not yet coding, we're just basically thinking about what could be prominent as we listen to all of these transcripts. But when you have finalized your transcripts, read through them again, ensure that they are clear, especially if you're using Zoom recordings also, make sure that you've double-checked the clarity and that it is the voice of the participant. And now that you've fully immersed yourself, you've double-checked, you've transcribed, you begin with the open coding process, which means that we start with open coding, which is an inductive form, which basically means we make up the labels as we read what participants have mentioned. We need to ensure that in the beginning, you're only going to code, but at some point, we're bringing similar experiences together, which means that you are going to engage with selective coding by bringing perceptions together in one label, combining what these participants have mentioned. These codes are then grouped into the categories, and these categories also evolve into the broader themes, considering if you are going to do 2 levels or 3 levels of coding, which basically means, are you going to engage with codes, categories, and themes, which are 3 levels, or are you just going to engage with codes and themes? Both of these processes are correct. And we usually say, if you're not sure whether 2 or 3 levels would be applicable, the more data you have, the more highly or the less the chances of you engaging with 3 steps are then quite relevant. Because what happens is if we code and we have too many frequency within a code, we usually move that code to a category and then identify the specificalities. So we always need to consider, is this too broad of a perspective? Do we need to refine into more specificalities? And as we move into this categorization process of building your themes, ask yourself, what is the relationship when I group things together? And these things are the labels and the codes. What do these things mean if I group them together? What do they say about each other? How do they address the research question? And would I need any data, or is this sufficiently adding to what this concept is? And when we talk about sufficiently, it means that we have enough information to make an interpretation of the context of that participant. And then finally, we move into the arguments. So we formulate an analytical argument by looking at how we've integrated the codes, by looking at how we've combined these codes into the theme and seeing how this relates to the literature and answers your research question. So what does coding look like in practice? So let's take this example. Obviously, the main component here is when you work through your data is to make sure that you read this data closely. And once you identify and read this information, fully immerse yourself, meaning reread it, even if you have to read it once more to ensure you know what's going on in your data, you can engage with it. But as you read this data closely, you then think about, can I identify meaningful units? And when I say meaningful units, we usually relate this to, can I highlight the perception from the transcript of the participants to ensure that I identify key things that participants are talking about? So if we look at this, I was constantly behind on assignments because I had to take care of my siblings while my mom worked late hours. I felt like no one at the university understood what I was really going through. my meaningful units that I can currently identify is one, being behind the assignments. But the reason behind these assignments is that this individual had to take care of their siblings and that this participant felt misunderstood or not understood. And these initial codes that I could have applied as being quite specific with regard, I could have mentioned that this participant is behind on assignments, which I feel is kind of redundant because it's already mentioned in that quotation. So therefore, I apply a code that reflects the behind the assignments, but also the reasons why. And therefore, I can apply the code academic delay due to caregiving. Or we could look at family responsibility. And I don't like the word impact. We usually add perceived impact, because impact is quantitative language. We need to align our codes with the language that we use. Therefore, we can only make approximations of the truth as we look at perceptions. Therefore, it's only perceived impact. But we also see that this individual felt that they are not understood within the university and therefore could have a code of lack of institutional empathy. And eventually I could then, if I coded all of my data, reflected, refined, reviewed, I can then group these related codes into the broader idea, which is then our themes, such as challenges to belonging, where we focus on just how they felt misunderstood. We could have had categories or themes related to home responsibilities interfering with the study. And this could have been the academic delay. It could have been related to maybe the interactions with what is happening at home and how these things at home could have interfered with the process of achieving your goals. But very importantly is to note that you keep track of the codes. And I can highly recommend using software such as Atlas DI or NVivo, or to make sure that as you go through this process, to keep a journal of what your code book looks like. I have a code. Why do I have this code? How does it relate to this context? Make it easier that I do not apply the same codes within, or codes that seem to be the same, that has different names. Could quite be evident. Therefore, with a code book, we need to ensure that we have the list of the codes, how they have been applied, and considering how they have been mentioned or applied within this specific context. Context meaning the sample that you've identified. So therefore, coding is the first act of analysis. How you frame the data will shape what you see. But just as poor statistical assumptions ruin quantitative analysis, bad coding practices can also damage the qualitative interpretation. So therefore, we need to ensure that it's crucial to avoid these common pitfalls. So therefore, we think about things such as overlapping. Overlapping means that codes are not clearly defined and cover similar content consistently, meaning that when we highlight that data from the interview, we maybe every time when we highlight, add a code of this and add a code of that, add a code of this and add a code of that, meaning that that section doesn't clearly align with only one idea, and that you constantly add too many ideas in a section that you've coded. So code overlapping is that codes are not clearly defined and therefore cover the similar content and therefore makes it difficult to differentiate what is the difference between them. This especially happens in the first cycle of coding, meaning you code, and eventually you realize that there are similar things and you therefore merge these things to ensure that there's not too many codes that overlap. Could also potentially be that your labels or your codes are quite vague, too general, and does not provide specific information about that data. Or it could be a mistake is that you only have one quotation per theme, meaning that themes should be supported by multiple quotations or data segments and not just one. So to look at the differences between clumsy or vague versus analytical coding. So if we take that example of the quotation I've just mentioned again, we could have had struggles as a code. But this is again too broad. It doesn't reveal what type or the cause of these struggles. So a better alternative would have been competing responsibilities in this student life. Or, for example, like we've mentioned earlier, academic delay due to caregiving. Looking at that they had to take care of their families, we could have had a vague code of family or university, or that their work is late. However, again, it doesn't really clarify the specificalities. There's unclearness, and therefore, if we look at late work, it describes the symptoms and not the read issue. So to ensure that you have better coding, ensure that you clarify, that you are direct, and that you have also outlined the specificalities of that issue. And for example, we could have then combined all of these perspectives or codes into the theme challenges. And again, this is a bit too broad for me. It's also very generic and overused within data, and it lacks analytical depth. We could have maybe been more specific based on the type of home challenges, the type of work challenges, the type of university or school challenges would have been a better. So therefore, clumsy codes are often too vague, too broad, too obvious. They don't help you to explain why something matters or how it connects to your research question. We also need to consider that if you're going to look at weak coding, that you also need to look at your code definition. It needs to be clear. It needs to be distinct. It needs to reflect the context of the participants. We also need to ensure that our data has some sort of connection, meaning that if I look at certain home difficulties, that my home difficulties would be connected in labels such as supporting the family, overwhelmed by the family, too many home tasks also, but again, being quite specific about how these things have an access towards one another. And therefore also considering that your interpretation needs to be meaningful of what participants say. We are not enforcing, or we don't have a too broad of an interpretation, and we ensure that it reflects the voices of the participants. So to ensure that we engage with trustworthiness, we have 5 main perspectives or criterions, which is credibility, tenability, confirmability, transferability, and reflexivity. So these are the main elements of value within qualitative data. And I'm going to go into the strategies. We can also look at Lincoln and Gruber as well as Moser, which then looks at how these strategies of trust is employed. And the first one that I would like to go in is having an audit trail, making sure that you have a diary of detailed records of what you have done, how you have done it, including decisions and the rationale behind them. Also to ensure that you have a code book, which I've already mentioned, but how you've outlined how codes were included, how they were excluded, and to provide a definition of how they were applied. Like I've mentioned, using Atlas TI or software tools to make sure that you can manage these data. All of these qualitative tools are not there just to analyze, but to help you manage this data. It does seem that I might go over 5 minutes in this workshop, hopefully not, but just so that you are aware, we might go over minutes. We also need to consider of the role of the researcher. Meaning, and this is quite important, I've seen a lot of universities having this as a requirement for your analysis, and that is reflecting, having a journal where you look at what is your personal biases, what are your assumptions, why you have coded this information, to ensure that you haven't enforced and maybe reflected on your bias. So we always say, if you're not sure what your assumptions are, think about, do you have any morals or values related to this topic? And then take your research questions before you analyze them. Answer them as if you were the participant, and that, ladies and gentlemen, could be a possible assumption. You also need to ensure that the strategy of thick description, meaning that you're not just going to mention why this code is important, you're going to provide the context and basically provide meaning to what these participants have mentioned. What is going on? Why is it important? But also to ensure that this is an iterative strategy. That within this iterative process, that you might even revisit earlier coding to test whether they are consistent and refine what you have identified. We also have strategies of peer debriefing, which basically means you discuss this coding process with other researchers, you obtain feedback, and therefore could help in the assistance of being consistent. So what we also do like within peer debriefing is having a discussion perhaps with your supervisor, outlining and getting feedback as to how this information is relevant. Is it understood by these individuals, and is the context clear? We also have another approach, which is known as intercoder reliability, whereby these softwares of qualitative analysis, like Atlas DI, has a component of intercoded reliability, which basically means that we assess how two different coders, meaning you've coded the data, you have your code book, you give this to an external person, they use your code book and apply, and therefore at the end, you two converse and see where did you agree on codes that should be applied, and where did you disagree, and if you disagree, you make sure that you come to an agreement of how this code should be applied. So therefore, as we've just looked at how to build this credibility, it is equally important to say, or to stay true to the voices of the participants. Data integrity means we don't bend what participants say to fit in our framework, but it's about anchoring every code in that actual words of what participants have mentioned, making sure that we avoid over-interpretation, making sure that we remain reflexive, thinking about what we have done, how we have done this information. And even the most beautiful code system is meaningless without this coding system and how you've applied this information. So make sure it's grounded in participants' voices. Make sure you don't impose personal interpretations too early. Keep memos to record your reasoning, and make sure that these quotes anchor your code so that you are consistent. And eventually, by following this process, you let the patterns emerge from the participants' voices before enforcing or forcing a structure. So maintaining this data integrity basically means that the coding processes are accurately represented from what you have mentioned about how your data is collected. We also need to ensure that when we engage with this coding process, that we move from descriptive coding to more analytical theming. So descriptive coding must evolve into an analytical theme, which basically means in descriptive coding, you only code by summarizing what the participants have said. But the moment when you have enough perspective, you move into the higher level interpretation, whereby we identify how we can group these things into a broader perspective, or kind of see what is the relationship between these codes. And if we can see that they can have a relationship or be combined together, we then group these codes into an overarching theme and think about how this theme addresses our research question. So as we get to the last slide, we need to ensure that when we think about these interpretations that we are making, that the theme is there to tell the story. Not behind the numbers, but behind the perspectives. So themes narrate the story behind the data, making sure that we understand the context, why it is important, how it has been applied, and thinking about what the interpretation is. Think of themes as the bridge between the raw voices and your final research message. So if we think about a discussion chapter, it starts with a theme, Why is it important? With that discussion, the thick description that is needed, it goes into the specific codes with their definitions, and therefore outlines how the quotations have been grouped into that code. So the theme provides the narrative. The theme connects the data into the broader meaning and its implications. So when you think about the story that you are telling, think about, how am I going to answer my research objective? Do I have sufficient information from the quotations? And did I ensure that these quotations have been grounded in codes, that we have sufficient meaningful data? So ladies and gentlemen, ensure that when quantitative analysis meets the assumptions, we trust the numbers. But when qualitative analysis meets good coding, we trust the meaning and the interpretations. So just as quantitative analysis relies on meeting statistical assumption to trust these numbers, qualitative analysis depends on the coding practices to ensure that this meaning derived is from the voices of the participants. So we are at the end of this presentation, and if you have any qualitative questions, please take the floor. Thanks, Hennie. Yes, Sutu, please unmute yourself.
Morning, Monica. Thank you for the presentation. I have two questions that I want to ask. Earlier, you mentioned inductive and deductive coding. Is it possible to mix that, like use both codings and like for your data analysis?
So if you are going to use book codings also, you need to ensure that you are clear about how did you get to those codes, where did you apply the framework, or where did you get this framework, and considering how it's going to apply in that specific context that you've identified. So even if you're going to deductive or deduce your codes, it needs to be clear, where did you develop this code book from? Where did you kind of borrowed ideas from other authors or other theories?
Okay, so in that sense, then if you're using, like, if you do deductive coding, you have to say from which framework you're using this code from. Then with that, you can be able to like use inductive coding to mix in with that. Okay.
Yes. Perfect. So making use of deductive from a framework that you've already borrowed, certain elements, making it clear how it applies, but also ensuring that if participants mention things not related to this framework, that you also code that. Yes.
Okay. And also, in I think the last few slides, you were talking about reflexivity, yes, and doing an autoethnography for my research. So I'm actually looking for some tips to see how I can remove my personal bias when I'm coding and interpreting my findings. Any?
Yes. So autoethnography, which is quite a very interesting topic and very popular lately, is where the researcher reflects from their stance of being part of a culture and so forth. So yes, there is going to be bias. There's always bias in qualitative interpretation, because you are the tool, meaning that in quantitative, we send out a scale, we get it back, we put it in SPSS, we test the assumptions, it tells us whether it's significant or not. But in qualitative, you decide on what am I going to talk about, especially considering an autoethnography study. So you are going to mention, what is this culture, why is it important, and what are the main things that you're going to focus on. So when you mention these things, you also need to reflect on, why am I mentioning this? Could it be that I'm maybe focusing too much on a certain element, and can I broaden my perspective? But the main thing here is to ensure that when you create codes, it's from your reflection of how it adds or addresses your research objectives. So I think the best approach for you would be, because autoethnography, you cannot fully eliminate the bias. You are talking about your own experience within a culture. So just make it clear what you are focusing, why you are focusing, and ensure that when you talk about your own experience, you relate it maybe to someone else in the literature who had a similar experience. So this is eliminating your bias by reflecting on what am I doing? Is it important to talk about this? But if I'm talking about this, when it's important, do I have other people that can also confirm or add to my story?
Okay, so thank you for that, because I'm also thinking, because I'm not just doing the autoethnography, I'm also doing in-depth interviews, so maybe that will help and probably cancel. So yeah, okay.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it works in that sense. Okay.
Yes, just to add to that, that would be, for example, data trustworthiness, where you use multiple types of qualitative data, such as your own ethnographical experience with semi-structured interview to ensure that this data is more of trust.
Okay, yes. Can you please repeat? You say data trustworthiness?
Yes, so trustworthiness, it is known as data triangulation.
Yes, okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sesutu. All right, I did see another hand, but it did disappear. So if you do have a question, please feel free. Yes, Lamre, please ask the question. I think you muted.
Sorry.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Mine is just a kind of a polite request. The last time you took us on the qualitative data on on-site, you promised to send the presentation slides and the recordings, and we've not got that up to now. Perhaps you are still working on it, or you must have forgot, or you sent. I have not got it. So it's just I will need that as well as these two. So thank you so much as you take time to look into it.
Thank you so much. Yes, if you attended one of my presentations from Atlas TI previously, I am almost at the end of creating this video. I think that by Wednesday, we are sending all of these presentations, but that's only for if you attended my previous workshops, but we are sending these presentations by end of Wednesday. But these presentations for today, we will send it quite earlier because this is already created. We don't need to create those videos.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. Also to note, currently on the screen, I have shared our contact details. If you need additional assistance, if you need a consultation, if your department needs some training, please feel free to either visit our website or to contact us, and we will forward this information or process this for you. I'm still going to keep this workshop open for another 2 minutes until 1:15. So if you still have a question, now is the time. Even if it's a quantitative or qualitative question, you can then ask it. If you feel shy, you can also ask your question in the chat. But we will keep this meeting open for another 2 minutes just to ensure if there's any questions that we can address it. If you do not have a question, ladies and gentlemen, me and Hennie both would like to thank you for your time, for joining, and we wish you good luck in your research journey to ensure that you have validated, but also insightful results.
Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, everybody.